This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's MINERALWARE.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to talk about pooling in Texas. And of course, like most other things, Texas is like a whole nother country when it comes to oil and gas. And the way that they manage pooling is no exception. And this is a contentious topic sometimes when you talk to Texas mineral owners, Justin.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And it's really pretty complicated aspect. There's some different things that you can walk into. And we were talking before we hit record about precedents. And in Texas, this was just kind of a way that it was handled. A precedent was set, and it's kind of continued forward in that way, and doesn't match most of the other states, which seems to be a bit more simple.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get started, let's define some terms. So if you're new to all of this, when we say pooling, we're talking about combining different mineral tracts together so that an operator can drill a well that's going to produce oil and gas from those combined tracts and from the reservoir below. And so the reason they do this is because there are rights that you have, that someone, if you drill a well in the adjacent tract, that they can't produce the minerals under your tract, basically, unless there's a horizontal well. And then that gets into what we're going to talk about today. But like just as a simple example, if somebody drilled a vertical well and it was going to produce from a 40-acre, reservoir below that well, and, that was right next to your minerals and you had 20 acres of the 40. Well, if you didn't lease it and if you weren't pooled, then you wouldn't get your fair share of the oil and gas. And so that caused a lot of problems back when oil and gas was first discovered and when they were drilling lots of different wells, and correlative rights and things like that became very important to make sure that we were protecting the reservoir, we weren't overproducing, but then also that we were not extracting oil and gas from adjacent mineral owners' tracts without their consent or without paying them. And so this whole concept of pooling is very common in oil and gas, and particularly since the advent of horizontal drilling, because wells now will go underground for 1, 2, 3, 4 miles. And, you have to be able to pool together the mineral rights underneath those wells in order to produce the oil and gas and to pay each mineral owner their proportional share of the royalties. So in Texas, of course, we don't have forced pooling. And so it becomes a very different animal when it comes to how operators have to navigate this in order to still be able to drill horizontal wells that cross multiple mineral tracts, and to do it in a way that is fair to the operators and the mineral owners, allows them to get permits and to drill those wells even if they don't have 100% of the minerals leased or consent from 100% of the royalty owners or mineral owners. And so there's this system that has developed because of that, really based on precedents that were set over time, both in case law as well as just practice by operators and the Railroad Commission. So Justin, do you want to dive into some of the details here?
Yeah, Matt. So one of the interesting things in the precedent side of things. So this originally came from a case that was Atlantic Refining Company versus Railroad Commission, known as the Normanna case. Texas Supreme Court struck down a proration formula that allowed a tiny 0.3 acre townsite lot to drain approximately $2.5 million worth of gas over 20 years, while that particular tract contained only $7,000 worth of actual reserves underneath. So the court ruling allowed allocation method, created massive uncompensated drainage for larger neighboring tracts, and failed to provide each producer a fair opportunity to recover their proportionate share. So that's kind of sets the stage where it started. And with Texas's forced pooling, so Matt, there's a couple different ways that they do this. And we hear allocation well a lot in Texas. And you were looking at some numbers before, and that seems to be kind of the method that is primarily used for this.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in all kinds of detail so you understand and you know what you need to know if you're dealt with this situation in terms of a well that's getting proposed, whether they're proposing to get your consent to pool the interest or to get you to sign a production sharing agreement or to basically go the allocation well route. But what Justin was talking about, that Normanna case, was really the event that caused the Texas Mineral Interest Pooling Act, or MIPA, to be created. And so the Texas legislature enacted MIPA in 1965, and they crafted it to reflect the state's philosophical resistance to forced pooling. So like we said, there's no forced pooling in Texas. So unlike the compulsory pooling statutes in other states like Oklahoma, like Colorado, like most of the other oil and gas producing states have some sort of a provision that allows operators to pool different mineral tracts together to get permits. And they have to get a majority of the mineral owners typically to get those leases in order to move forward. And so in Texas, though, they wanted to make sure, and really there's pretty robust provisions that requires applicants that want to pool in Texas to prove that they made a fair and reasonable offer to the mineral owners before any compulsory action is considered. And so essentially, they can't just say, oh yeah, we mailed them here this lease form that was the best and final offer that we had. It's like, no, we have to show and demonstrate that we made concerted effort and we reached out several times and we made those offers and we tried a good faith negotiation and it just fell apart. So it's very basically cumbersome from that standpoint. But in that situation, it's essentially, it allows pooling, but it's typically through voluntary pooling. And so unlike other states, again, the MIPA allows for either operators or mineral owners to force inclusion in drilling units under very specific circumstances. From a mineral owner perspective, what this means is you have some rights to force an operator to include your small tract, if it looks like you're being left out. The unit outline kind of goes around your tract, although it clearly should have been included. Well, you can try to force that to get included in that. And again, if it's a pooling situation. And so it's rarely used, I would say, in Texas. So it's, even though it does exist, it's existed for, at this point, 60 years on the books. But I would say it's pretty much the minority of wells that get permitted go through that whole MIP process and get the voluntarily pooled situation. Now, there's multiple reasons, I think, and this is my opinion. I haven't done a lot of detailed research. But if you think about over time how mineral tracts have gotten fragmented over time as they're handed down through the generations, the more and more mineral owners that you have, it makes it harder and harder to obtain the required percentages to get consent from everybody to go through that pooling, that voluntary pooling action, and getting them to agree to pooling clauses in their leases, which is typically many Texas mineral owners will try to not include that. And so again, and then it also just depends on the specific situation of the unit being proposed and how advantageous would it be for you to get pooled versus going the allocation well route. And we'll talk about what we mean by that here in a second, because it can make a big difference on how much you get paid in terms of your interest in those wells. But essentially, when you have strong pooling language and the argument for excluding that pooling language in your lease and giving you lots of protection there, and having that strong pooling language in your lease basically allows you to negotiate provisions that can protect your interests, such as limiting the size, the maximum size of those pooled units, so that your interest won't be diluted too much and things like that. And so it can be a strategy or a tactic you use when you negotiate a lease to try to to get that and use that as a tool to try to protect your interests, or give you a little bit extra rights so that when you get approached, you have a say over what happens. So that's the MIPA situation. And that's essentially, on the books, but again, it's more of a voluntary pooling rather than forced pooling. And so what have operators done, Justin, to try to navigate this given that limitation in place?
So, Matt, allocation wells or a Texas-specific solution to trying to figure out how do we effectively produce these minerals. With allocation wells, it really helps the operator out because they're working within the confines of the original owner. And there may be some modification, but it's not quite like pooling where you're really pooling in a lot more sections and land.
Yeah, exactly. And so the benefit is that they don't have to get the pooling authority, even though the tracts that they're producing from may be owned by different lessors or different mineral owners. And so really, essentially what we're talking about with the allocation well, it's like Justin said, where you have a horizontal well that's drilled across 2 or more lease lines without creating a pooled unit. And you may wonder, well, how's that any different than pooling? And it all boils down to how they calculate the interest in those wells. Again, because there's no provision that dictates how production is going to be shared between the different mineral tracts, they have to be more, detailed around how they're going to allocate well production to each mineral owner. And the way that this has all come about essentially is kind of an interesting historical situation. Justin, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, man. So the historical precedence to this is the Royal Commission granted the first allocation well permit in 2010, Devon Energy. And Devon had attempted to secure a production sharing agreement from interest owners, but lacked the requisite 65% approval. Nevertheless, Devon still applied for the permit, but labeled the well as an allocation well, and the RCC approved the permit. With that, the allocation well was born, which required no approval, as in zero approval from the interest owner. And Matt, again, this is very different for forced pooling because they have to get that authorization from the owners to group all of those interests together and split the percentage. Texas kind of has a workaround with that because they're able to do these allocation wells, which seems to have grown out of precedence and still used commonly today.
Yeah, exactly. So in other states that have compulsory pooling, they need to usually get the majority of the mineral owners, between 51% or 65% or whatever the percentage is based on the state. But they do need to get approval and get all of those leases in place in order to apply and have the State Oil and Gas Commission approve the pooling order. Well, like Justin said, because they can't do that in Texas, Devon said, well, we want to drill these horizontal wells. We can't go the pooling route. And there's other methods you can get some sort of sharing agreement or some pooling, essentially. But in that case, this whole allocation well concept was born just by virtue of the need to combine different mineral tracts together to drill horizontal wells. And 2010 is kind of an important date because that's sort of the advent and really when horizontal drilling became mainstream and was really taking off. And so when you look at all these unconventional oil and gas plays across the country, that's when you'll see a lot of the activity starting is around that 2010 to 2015 timeframe, depending on the area. So that's, in this case, in Texas, there's a ton of activity. People are starting to look at, hey, we're able to drill horizontally. We can use hydraulic fracturing to unlock the oil and gas that's in place, but we need to get permits to do this. And how do we go about it? And Devon set the precedent and really got the ball rolling with these allocation wells. Now, there is another concept out there, not just to make this even more confusing, but there is a concept called a production sharing agreement well as well. So that is a situation where as long as they get 65% of approval of all of the royalty owners in the tracts that are crossed by the well, they can get what's called a production sharing well or PSA well permit. And so that is something that does happen as well, although it appears based on the data that is not the most common. It's allocation wells for whatever reason, again, just depending on the specific ownership characteristics of the area. Sometimes there are pooled units that are formed. If there are just, I think, a handful of mineral interest owners, they will agree to terms with the operator, and then the operator will pool that together. And so you'll see those in some places. I was working on a project for a client in Martin County where that's the case. Whereas on the flip side, looking at some stuff, in the Eagle Ford, it seems like are mostly allocation wells. And it just really, again, totally depends. And there's no rules that say that it has to be one or the other. Again, it just depends on when the operator looks at the different owners and who they can get approval from. And then that'll dictate, I think, which path they go down.
You said it, man. And originally, the Railroad Commission would issue a horizontal well permit for an allocation well only if the operator represented that it had a production sharing agreement with at least that 65% interest. But that was something that was changed, and a few years ago, and perhaps this was during the boom with everything being so crunched for folks to approve permits and for operators to do work. The RCC decided that it could issue permits for allocation wells without requiring the operator to attain that production sharing, which meant it seems like it is a bit more of a simple mechanism already. And I'm sure that really added or removed a regulatory burden that made the operators look at it as an advantageous way for them to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to recap what we talked about so far. So we've talked about MIPA and voluntary pooling, talked about those production sharing agreement wells, PSA wells, and then we've talked about allocation wells. And you'll see that a lot of times abbreviated as AW when you see a name of a well. That can be a good indicator that that's an allocation well. Now you have to look at the details, of course, and that can change, once between when a well is permitted and when it actually was drilled. But those are some signs you can see when you look at the Railroad Commission website. So I think the big thing that, really we want to know the difference is, what does it mean for the bottom line at the end of the day from a mineral and royalty owner perspective? And there can be a big difference. And essentially, when you think about a pooling situation, and especially if you're familiar with other states that have voluntary or forced pooling, you're combining the acreage of all those mineral tracts together. So a very simple example of this is if you had one net mineral acre, wherever it is in part of a unit that is comprised of two sections of land or 1,280 acres, let's just say you're leased at 25%. Your decimal interest in all the wells in those two sections, let's say there's a dozen horizontal wells that are going to be drilled in that unit, and you could easily calculate that by 1 divided by 1,280 times 25% for your royalty rate. So that's one net acre out of 1,280 acres multiplied by your lease royalty rate, and that's your proportional share. That's your decimal interest in all of those wells that are going to produce from that unit. That's very simple. That's something that anybody can calculate. If you're looking at your state oil and gas commission, you look at the plat, you see that that's a scenario. You can calculate your interest in those wells. So when you get your division order, it's easy to determine what you should be getting paid. And then you can say, yeah, that looks right. Everything's good. I'm going to cash the check when I get it. And then you move on. Well, in Texas with allocation wells, it gets kind of complicated because what you end up having to do is look at the productive lateral length generally through your tract and or through the unit. So there's other times when there's allocation wells or PSA wells that will combine multiple pooled units together, and they'll allocate production based on the productive lateral length through that unit that you have an interest in. And so it depends on the situation. You have to look at the plats. You have to talk to the operator and see the way they're planning to allocate production, and that'll determine what your decimal interest is. And in the case of just talking about two concepts, that first example that I gave where you got pooled, well, if you have, let's say, a large mineral tract, so you have a large net acreage, let's say 100 net acres, and the well is going to produce effectively from, let's just go to the 1,280 acre scenario like we talked about. But if that unit were in Texas and it was an allocation well, and let's say your tract, the well only maybe 10% of the wellbore goes through your tract, well, you're only going to be allocated, your proportional share of that production based on your net interest in that tract, and then what the proportion of that wellbore that goes through your tract versus the entire productive lateral length. And so in that situation, you would have a much smaller decimal interest in that well in the allocation well scenario as compared to the pooled unit scenario that I mentioned earlier. All things being equal, same number of net acres, same overall unit size, and so forth. So it really just totally depends on the very specific facts as to whether or not a pooling situation is better for you or a allocation well is better for you. And if you look at the plat of the wells that are proposed and you see where those well bores are going, and if they go through the majority of your interest, then allocation well is probably going to be more advantageous. Whereas if those wells are only a small portion goes through the unit that you have an interest in or through your mineral tract, then in that case, you're going to have, less of an interest. So yeah, it just really is an interesting dynamic that comes into play in Texas, where in this situation, if you're dealing with allocation wells and whatnot, it's generally a good idea to get help from an expert just to help you navigate that situation to make sure that you understand your interest and that it's correct when you get your division order. Because Texas, it does also require you to sign a division order before putting you in pay status. And so allocation wells add that level of complexity, that some expertise or some knowledge of kind of the details and how you need to calculate the interest in those wells is required to do it correctly.
Yeah, you said it, Matt, which, unfortunately makes it pretty complicated on the mineral owner side. But if I'm a mineral owner, I'm thinking, okay, I'm in this negotiation with the oil and gas company over leasing. What are the chances that I can impact their decision whether to pool or whether to drill an allocation?
Yeah, and I think you getting that strong pooling language in the lease does give you that right to, ratify it, if it does get proposed. Whereas if you do sign a lease that allows for pooling, then, you're already in the bucket of allowing them to go through the MIPA route or the PSA route without your additional consent potentially. So yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to have it in place so that you can have a say, and they can use that as a bargaining chip to get maybe a higher royalty rate or something like that. That's always, it's just another concession that you could give. Say, well, okay, I'll allow pooling if you give me a 25% royalty or whatever. That's or no post-production deductions or whatever the thing you really want. Because ultimately, it may be more advantageous for you to get pooled. It depends on the specific outline of that proposed unit and where your minerals are relative to the wells that are going to get drilled.
You said it, Matt. And with Texas, the way that allocation well law is, it really it comes down to the operator and how they decide to handle it. There's some operators that will drill the allocation wells and not really approach mineral owners because they reserve that right. There's others that will make sure there's a PSA or will contact owners, even though maybe they don't have to in Texas. I know I've had that experience with different operators, Matt. It just depends on how they handle it in some ways. But it's an interesting thing in Texas that you don't see a lot of other places. When you see an allocation well being drilled, if you don't understand what's going on, you're really surprised to see that they're drilling this well and weren't contacted, you weren't notified. And Texas gives the operators that right with some hoops to jump through.
Yeah. So there's, if it depends on what's being proposed, sometimes you will get a notice, sometimes you won't. It just depends on the situation. But yeah, I would say that it's just important to understand, and it seems kind of counterintuitive that, okay, well, if they're allowing them to produce from multiple mineral tracts, isn't that just pooling by another name? And I guess you could argue that it is, but it's a different, again, you're not pooling proportionally your share of the minerals in all of those tracts. It's based on how much of the minerals are going to be produced from your interest. And so that's, from that standpoint, they actually treat a horizontal well as a vertical well for the purposes of the lease and for allocating production. And so it's pretty interesting because even though, like I said, you have those horizontal wells that can traverse lease lines, well, each tract is treated as if it holds a vertical well, and they allocate production accordingly through the wells that go through that tract. And so it's interesting because they can demonstrate, and it's been challenged, right? So there, you may think, well, certainly this is, people that are opposed to this would have challenged it and get it overturned. Well, it was actually a pretty big case that was decided, I believe it was in 2024, the Railroad Commission of Texas and Magnolia Oil and Gas v. Opiella. And I think this was in South Texas, where Opiella's had lease that prohibited pooling, and they had a production sharing agreement and allocation well authority that was granted, to the operator by the Railroad Commission to drill a well. They opposed that and lost in court. So it was interesting because, you would think that, well, okay, this allocation well, they can't pool. We believe that allocation well is just like, pooling basically, and we're going to call a duck, and went through the courts, and they said no, actually it's not the same as pooling. And so it has been challenged in court, and it actually has stood the test of that. And it seems to be really the primary way that operators are going forward in permitting wells nowadays. So if you look at some of the statistics, since the start of 2022, the Railroad Commission has granted just under 5,000 allocation well permits versus just under 600 PSA well permits. So, when you look at horizontal well permits, it's allocation wells and PSA wells that are the majority of those horizontal permits. There are some pooling situations that happen. Again, I think it's probably dependent on the large, ranch owners or things like that have the majority of the minerals that come to an agreement with the operator that allow them to pool effectively, or it's effectively they're just producing from one lessor, and so they don't have to pool multiple mineral tracts or multiple mineral owners together. And that's why you see those pooled units. Basically, it's because it's like, yeah, that's under their ranch and they own 100% of the minerals underneath there. So that's why. But yeah, I think it's a necessary methodology, and it's good that it's in place, I think, from the standpoint of allowing for development to occur. Because if you think about the requirement, if they only had MIPA, there was no other way to get it done, people didn't want to get pooled, well, the operators a lot of times wouldn't be able to drill a well because they wouldn't be able to get the majority royalty owners or mineral interest owners leased and approve the PSA wells, and so they'd just have to move on. And that means that we lose out as royalty owners from receiving royalties if they can't drill. So it's good on one hand. Obviously it depends on your situation. It might have been better to get pooled depending on what the details are of your wells.
You said it, Matt. And yeah, and it creates an interesting, we were talking about before we hit record, with forced pooling, you have the statutory minimum royalty that's applied. And because Texas doesn't have that mechanism, there's a bit of a different way that they handle it. And you hear it called unleased co-tenant. Maybe there's other phrases for this, but that's a mechanism where there's a payback that happens for your interest. And then after that payback penalty is paid forward, you back into your interest based on your proportional share. So kind of like that statutory minimum, but as I've talked to you about, Matt, there's some question marks on that payback percentage. And I know you know a bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think it really depends. If it's a MIPA situation, the operator is allowed to have a risk penalty. So similar to forced pooling in other states where, they can collect 200% of the cost of drilling and completing that well before the forced pooled mineral interest owner backs into their 100% working interest and receives their proportional share of the revenue and the expenses going forward. So that is something that exists. But then in other situations, in fact, they can only recoup 100% of the cost of drilling and completing the well, and before they back the unleased co-tenant backs into their proportional share of the expenses and the revenue and become, that working interest owner basically. So effectively, when you go non-consent in Texas, it depends on the situation. It actually may be more beneficial as a mineral interest owner, just because it's quicker once they reach payback on just 100% versus 200%. You'll start receiving that revenue. So it's like a carried interest. Basically, they're carrying your interest, and then you back into that once they've paid back their investment. So it's kind of advantageous to the landowner in that perspective. And if you are an unleased co-tenant, I know you've dealt with this, Justin. You want to talk through like the different options that people have if they're in that situation? They may think that, well, I guess I'm just stuck here, but not necessarily.
No, there are a lot of different options that you can look at. Hopefully the situation, the operator would like to sign a lease, and that is an ideal situation. And if that's not the case, like we've talked about many times with leasing, you can go into the county and see who is in the area and see if maybe somebody else is interested in leasing. But man, I found the hardest part of this to be that it's really on you to track and make sure you're staying up with what that payback break-even point is, and making sure the operator stays honest on getting you. And then because it's working interest, there's liability that comes with that, with the plugging and abandoning of the well.
Yeah, so there's some nuance to it. But, if you find yourself, and I'd say particularly in a situation, if you're, let's say in West Texas, where there's a lot of drilling going on near where you are, you'll have an easier time selling that lease. So effectively, someone is going to want to participate in those new wells that are going to get drilled on your minerals. If you're an unleased co-tenant, you may be able to find a group that's interested in leasing those minerals from you, and so that you can just receive the royalties and you don't have to deal with that whole situation going forward, because they want the ability to get a working interest in that area. And it's, pretty competitive and it's hard to come by. So that could be a situation where you do have bargaining power. Again, if it's an area where there's some future development that's either proposed, like there are permits that are proposed and you're getting AFEs and getting asked to participate, that could be an option for you to lease if you're an unleased co-tenant. But if not, then, you have the ability to consider whether you're going to go that route. I'd say most people, if you're not like really in the oil and gas industry or wanting to really roll up your sleeves and get intimately familiar with everything that you need to know, most people are better off leasing rather than going down that path, but potentially have options, again, if you're in a good area.
All right, Matt. So the $1 million question, how do we tell as mineral owners what type of well we have? This is an allocation well. What are the different ways that we can look at that? And then along with that, let's recap the actions that mineral owners should take. You mentioned that with allocation wells, confirming the percentage interest, it can be a bit tricky, but what are the things that we should do if we see that that's happening on our property?
Yeah, I think the main thing is to go to the Texas Railroad Commission website and look up your property, look at those wells, download the permits and download the plats. That'll show you what type of well is being proposed. And so you can go to episode 226, where we have a video that we recorded on how to use the Texas Railroad Commission website. So you can go to my YouTube channel. So just search for Matt Sands Mineral Rights and go to the how-to video section, that playlist. Or you can go to the Mineral Rights Podcast website, just mineralrightspodcast.com, look up episode 226 and watch that video. Download those documents and you'll see there what type of well is being proposed. You'll see it shows on the permit itself if it's an allocation well. And then oftentimes as well, if it's a pooled unit, there'll be a P12 form that shows all the different tracks and the allocation to those tracks and things like that. And so if it doesn't have that, or if it's, there's the plat will also show if it's allocation unit or allocation well. So all of those things together, you can use that to figure out what type of well it is. And then if you want to roll up your sleeves, you can learn how to calculate your interest. And we'll put some links in the show notes for some resources where you can research that and figure out how to calculate your interest in those allocation wells. Or if you need some specific help, I'm happy to help. I can help you verify your decimal interest if you get a division order. I do appraisals and valuations in my day job. And so that's something that if you need some hand holding, I can help with that as well. But those are the ways that I would go about it. And thankfully, this information is all public information, so you should be able to easily find it on the Texas Railroad Commission website.
All right, Matt, anything about allocation wells that we shared? It's unique to Texas. Forced pooling is an option in Texas, but it's not commonly used like it is in other states. And it's kind of its own beast.
Yeah, it's its own beast. And it'll be interesting. I don't know if this Opiella family case, if it goes to the Texas Supreme Court, if it does get challenged, then all bets are off and they'll have to go back to figuring out how to do this going forward. But for now, allocation wells are truly different than forced pooling, where you're, basically getting grouped together equally or proportionally based on your net interest with all the other owners in that unit. It's very specific to the location of the wells relative to your minerals, and it can be advantageous actually to have an allocation well, or it can be more advantageous to have a pooled unit, just depending on, again, where those wells are and relative to your mineral tract and what you own. So again, it just really totally depends. And it's an interesting dynamic that has evolved in Texas. And of course, it's, got to be even more difficult and more interesting in Texas when it comes to oil and gas and really kind of everything. But it keeps it interesting for sure.
You said it, Matt, and keeps good oil and gas attorneys in Texas in business.
That's right. Yeah, there's a lot of them out there, and that's one of the reasons why. So, all right. Well, thanks again for listening. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you're a Texas mineral owner and are faced with pooling or allocation wells, now you know everything you need to know to be dangerous as a mineral owner, and knowledge is power when it comes to this stuff. So hopefully this was useful. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.